Thank you very much for coming today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. My pleasure.
I'm really glad that when you saw the invitation that I dropped on social network for bringing new people into this project, you were the first actually to answer and say that you'd be happy to come. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You must be a very busy man, so really appreciate your time. Can you start by introducing yourself, who you are, where you come from, what you do in terms of martial arts and work, please? I think your work in martial arts have heavy connections, so that's important.
Well, some of them do. My name is Lance Gatling. I'm an American citizen. First came to Japan on the way to Korea in 1979. I was in the U.S. military. I was an Army officer assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division heading for the demilitarized zone in Korea, and had never been into Asia as a 20-something-year-old young man. And I stopped in this marvelous place called Japan. And in those days, aircraft could not fly at night in Seoul. They would all be shut down. So it was required that anyone trying to travel from the United States to Korea would actually land in Japan, get off a giant Northwest 747 full of other soldiers and business people, and be bussed off to a small hotel near Narita to get up the next morning very early to get back on the same plane and fly into Seoul. And when I did, I rode through the countryside around Narita. It's very different from today, but there were probably 30 of us packed in a microbus that I couldn't believe they could get that many people in this tiny thing, but we drove along and I saw these beautiful rice fields. And I grew up in a farming family in eastern Arkansas, and one of the crops we raised was rice, and it was just manicured. Everything was beautiful, everything was clean, there was no trash anywhere, which was a tremendous contrast to Korea of 1979 and 80, which was still very much a developing country. I mean, the development has been astonishing in Korea, but in Japan, you could see that there had been tremendous development and recovery. And I became interested in it. Spent a year in Korea, went back to the United States, and convinced the Army to put me into a program called a Foreign Area Officer. The Army at that time had the mission to provide operations people who understood the language, the culture, the history, the businesses, the government, the policies, and the character of countries where the Army operated. And I was fortunate to be chosen to take Japanese professionally, to study Japanese professionally, and to come to Japan to finish that language training. So I had a second graduate degree in East Asian Studies and a double major in Soviet Studies from graduate school. And then 2.5 years of full-time Japanese study. That was my job for 2.5 years. And when I came to Japan, I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy, studying in Yokohama. There was a U.S. State Department language school there. And at the end of that assignment, I was supposed to return to the United States and fulfill a analyst position in the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I convinced the Army to leave me here, and I essentially never left. So I went to U.S. Army Japan as a bilateral operations officer working with the Japanese. And then the Army kept saying, you have to go to Washington. We want you to go to the Pentagon. And I said, I don't want to go to Washington. I want to work here. And I had a second assignment at the embassy. And at Camp Zama, I had an introduction to Japanese martial arts. I had taken, as a cadet at West Point, I had taken some Judo, but mostly Shotokan Karate Do. My instructor, I say instructor, he was a senior student. We didn't have an instructor, we had students. He was South Vietnamese, Republic of Vietnam. He was the son of a general, and his English wasn't great. He was a lovely young man, and he and I kind of got along, and he taught me Shotokan karate a lot. The judo was very primitive. Essentially, we didn't have an instructor at the time. They have a very accomplished judo program at West Point now, but when we were doing it, was mostly young men trying to kill each other, and they succeeded on a regular basis of damaging people pretty severely. So I wasn't attracted to it until I got into the U.S. Embassy. At U.S. Army Japan, I had a friend, is Captain Guy Power, who retired later from the Army as one of the foremost U.S. proponents of Nakayama do. And it appealed to him, I think, if I understood his point. It was kind of the bare bones military style basic EI techniques for a soldier. And he's since retired from practicing, but at the time I honestly didn't understand the attraction. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it, and I also didn't practice. But when I got to the U.S. Embassy, there was a judo dojo inside the U.S. Embassy housing area. And it turned out to be very near my apartment, which was outside the housing area. And I started mostly to take jujutsu. I had taken Hapkido in Korea, which has most of its roots in Aikido, but adds kicks and punches. But it's very much an Aikido influence, hard Aikido influence style. Of course, the legend is that it's an ancient Korean art, but the roots, I think now that people are tracking it pretty clearly, it's essentially a hard style Aikido. But when I went to the embassy, unbeknownst to me or most anybody else, there's actually a dojo inside the embassy. And later I found the records to show that the first people inside the U.S. Embassy to take judo were some women, actually, from 1906. And they were taught judo by a woman who had been taught by one of Kano's students who learned judo in secret from Kano. And I actually have a record of this, that Kano was secretly teaching women in the 1890s, early 1900s. And it doesn't appear in the Kodokan records anywhere. But there's always an interest in the American embassy and people with judo. So my sensei was a graduate of Meiji and went into the Kodokan International Division because he spoke English. He'd studied English in college. But he started teaching in what is now Akasaka, teaching service members and diplomats from the U.S. Embassy, which is close by, and he had a dojo in the basement of a U.S. military hotel. He lost his lease, and one of his students was one of the administrative officers of the embassy who convinced the ambassador to allow him to use a large storeroom in the basement of the embassy as a dojo. So they had permission to actually teach judo inside the embassy. As far as we know, it's the only thing like that in history. That embassy building was torn down, and a lot of offices that were outside of the embassy compound were accumulated and reorganized to be in one building. So he didn't have a place to do it. He actually built a building on the current U.S. Embassy housing compound. He dismantled a small building he had and turned it into a dojo. And then later we actually have a purpose-built 40-mat dojo, which kind of ironically turns out to be the same size as the original custom-built Kodokan dojo. It's where they worked out most of the techniques. It was a 40-mat dojo. So he taught there from 1957 until he died 5 years ago. And I was taking, at the time, I was taking judo there, judo and jujutsu, Nihon Jujutsu, his style. I was also taking Jodo, and taking judo at places like the Nihon Budokan and the Budo Gakkai. and made connections with people in the Shinagawa Judo Association. And I didn't know anything about judo organizations or history, other than, I'd read, like most people, I'd read some of the top-level histories of Kano. And I didn't have any rank. I started at 35 or so, and I'm 50-something. And I didn't have any Kodokan rank or any judo rank. And I went to the Nippon Budokan, and I was taking Jodo there for several years. And I didn't know it at the time. These were the top instructors of the art, the senior policemen or retired policemen or very, very senior kendo guys. And so I've taken Jodo from almost all of the top instructors of the main line associated with the Zen Kenrin and the police. And they had a judo class across the hall. And one day I signed up and they asked me, "Do you have any judo rank?" I said, "No, I don't have rank. I just do judo. And I just like to do judo, but I don't have any rank." I said, "Okay, so you have to ask the instructor." And I asked the instructor, who turned out to be a former police judo specialist. They bring in young men and women, but they bring them in and they can stay up to 10 years as judo specialists teaching at the Judo Academy. And then they either have to become a regular policeman, usually a patrolman, a beat cop, or something. They have to stay current as policemen, but they cannot remain. Only one person remains in the program and becomes the Shihan of the program. Everybody else has to go to regular jobs. So he had dropped out at 10 years and become a businessman. So I showed up and I had my gi on. I put on my white belt and went in, and about 3 minutes into the practice, the uchikomi, he walked up and I felt this giant finger poking me in the back, and he says, "Kochi, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, thought you said we're going to do uchikomi." He goes, "But you said you don't have any rank." I said, "I don't have any rank." He says, "But how do you know all this judo?" And I told him his story. And it turned out that his father was a very high-ranking judoka in the International Martial Arts Association, International Martial Arts Federation, where my sensei was the managing director. And of all the people in Tokyo who would have known this, it would be him, because there are very, very few people in the general judo world who understand this association. So I started getting rank inside the normal judo circles. And only then did I start to realize that all of judo is unified. It doesn't have 100 different splinter groups like karate-do or aikido or whatever. Judo is more or less unified. And as I dug up the history, my sensei had a big argument with the powers that be at the Kodokan after Mifune sensei died, and he left the Kodokan and never went back in. But the 10th Dans of the Kodokan remember my sensei when they were all young men, and they're now in their 90s, but they remember him being in the international division of the Kodokan. So I took Judo, Jodo, and Takeuchi-ryu Jujutsu, and I just love the Koryu Jujutsu styles with all the weapons, all the interesting moves and the techniques. But when my sensei died, there was a period where another gentleman ran the dojo, but he returned to the United States, and if I had not stepped in, the dojo would have died. So it's been there since 1957, and I hope it continues for another 50, 60 years, but we do what we can. Right now, of course, it's all suspended. So as part of this introduction to the mainstream of judo, I started reading the history of judo, trying to figure out what's the real history of judo, because there were some things that didn't make sense to me. Some traditional explanations for the organizations and the people involved that didn't pass kind of a first cut at looking below the surface to see what really happened. And my study of Judo history became a study of the history of Kano Jigoro, the founder of Judo. And through that, I've opened a door into a history of Japan, I think, that is completely unique, in that Kano was a man who was very heavily involved in the development of Japan as we see it today. Not only him, but a number of his very close associates were the people who essentially created Japan as we know it today. And all of the tales of the Showa era, late Meiji, Taisho, early Showa era, of what martial arts is, what Japanese culture is, even what the language is, was decided by a relatively small group of people that included Kano Jigoro. So I realized that in following his life that I could actually follow the development of modern Japan. And he dies in 1938 when Japan is on the course. It's already at war with China. It's on a collision course with the entire planet. The destruction of Japan is witnessed by Kano's family, and particularly his nephew, Nango Jiro, who was an Imperial Japanese Navy Marine who took over the Kodokan after Kano died. So in just tracking these two men and their organizations, their influences, the people they work with, I could discern the development and fall of Imperial Japan in a way that I had not seen. And I have 2 master's degrees in the area. I've been in Japan for 35 years. I've read everything I could get my hands on about Japan, and I didn't realize many of these things.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean. I mean, I did university, Japanese studies at university, and the same thing happened to me when I started working on the history of Budo and Kano, but also Morihei Ueshiba in Aikido and some other teachers. It's like, wow, come on. This maybe it's not the most important, the most significant steps of the Japanese history, but it explains why things happen this way. It's really, I don't think Budo has much to do with politics or whatever. No, but at the time, it was to a level that it's hard to imagine today.
It's all intertwined, and it wasn't by accident. So what we see of Japan today is fascinatingly, to my new way of thinking, enlightened to the extent that it is by these 15 years. I've been studying this for 15 years. And I started with just standard text. Judo was this, Kano was this, all the way down to Kano's personal letters, the people he interacted with, events that have never been discussed in English as far as I know. Some of the documents and some of the letters, articles about Kano and his activities, criticisms of him, praises of him. And it's not just a hagiography of Kano. This is a fascinating man who is completely misunderstood today, I think.
There are very, very few documents and academic studies on Budo in general, and even on Kano. If you look on the academic databases for Kano Jigoro, you can find a few papers, but not that much. And the few books you find are not academic studies. So it's often, I think it's a waste that there are so few academic studies on Budo. But Japanese people don't do it. So if Japanese people don't do it, it's even harder for foreigners to do it, right? It
is difficult for someone who hasn't done this type of study in the depth to understand where to look. And after 12, 15 years, I could get to the point where I'd see an organization and I'd read about the organization, and sometimes I could foretell if Kano was involved in that organization. Just from the timing, who was the head, what was the mission, and I'd say, okay, I'll go find the membership roster of this organization. Sometimes it'd take me months or a year to find the membership roster. But if I thought that Kano was involved, often he was involved. He was a member. He was an active member, sometimes a director of the organizations. So Kano's role as the head of Judo, I think, is very overstated. His role as an educator has been well explored by Japanese, and his role in the Olympics. So this search has taken me all over Japan. I've been to Geneva to the International Olympic Committee archives to find his letters to the president, his secret letters. Read at the top, please don't show anybody else in the Japanese delegation what I'm telling you. And then other letters from other people in the Japanese delegations saying the same thing. Please don't tell the old man Kano that we're having this discussion. So there's huge amount of politics involved. And it was very disappointing to me recently to see the NHK Taiga drama, the Idaten, the story of the runner, who was in fact, I think, portrayed as a loon. I mean, he's kind of a laughable figure who doesn't make sense, and Kano is this kind of flamboyant, scheming little man. And some of these characters that I think I know so well, they were so misportrayed that this is one of the reasons that I started displaying some of my research to show this was such a disservice to Kano and what he did. That I really don't understand exactly what NHK was about. I mean, I love the production values and the period costumes, but it was so over the top that I'd love to have a chance to redo it the correct way.
But the Japanese, they don't really care about real history. The point is, they're just telling a story that they like.
Yes.
That be it true or not, that's not really the problem. Even on a certain level, even in the school history books, they're just telling the story they want to tell. It's not lies, but it's full of holes.
It's full of holes. It's superficial. It gets the job done, and this is not new to Japan. So Kano and his counterparts set up the education system, and it was intentionally kept at a very low level until you got to university. And then they would start exposing the select few to a much broader history, a much deeper history. But at the elementary school and the middle school level, preparatory type schools, these were the men who chose what they would teach the children. Budo becomes one of the things that Kano wants to teach the children. He wants Budo into the school system. He established Judo and doesn't really talk about it so much until like the late 1880s when he gives a lecture. Actually, a teacher who taught English under Kano at the Gakushuin gave a lecture on what Judo was about. And it was not a martial art, it was a teaching mechanism that Kano really had only roughly formed by then. He claims later that by 1889, Judo was fully formed. It's clear it's not. It's not fully formed by 1889. What he's done is taken Tenjin Shinryu Jujutsu and Kitoryu Jujutsu, along with many other techniques from other schools, and kind of glommed them together. And they're practicing, and he's not even teaching most of the time. He's bringing in outside teachers. And this notion that a 22-year-old in 1882 establishes the Kodokan and starts teaching Judo is just simply not true. In fact, the very room that he rented at the...
It's not that it's not true, it's just not possible. You cannot teach at this level to people who will recognize you as the fantastic martial artist at 22. Even now in Japan, when you're 30, people make fool of you because they think you're too young, whatever your experience. When you're 22, I mean, seniority in Japan is so important that thinking that he did that alone is kind of strange.
Well, he had a close group of young men that he learned with. They all learned together, and they brought in outside teachers. The Kodokan histories don't talk much about them, but they existed. In fact, the very rooms that he rented at Eishoji, the temple, the Buddhist temple, that you can still visit today, were originally rented by another jujutsu teacher. That's how Kano knew those rooms were available, that someone he knew was using them to teach jujutsu. So he took it over and actually established his juku first. He established a private school and then opened the Kodokan, which was encouraging the students at the juku to practice what then was called jujutsu, Kano-ryu jujutsu. And he uses the terms interchangeably for many, many years. So once again, the simplified version is he opens the Kodokan in 1882 and starts teaching judo. But they're really feeling their way along to figure out what judo is. And there's an effort not by Kano, but some other gentlemen, and there's a group of kinjutsu instructors and jujutsu instructors who are trying to get the Ministry of Education to allow them to have an exercise form of kinjutsu, exercise form of jujutsu installed as the physical education system in the schools. So it's evaluated and it's turned down. And they have some very specific objections to both kendo and jujutsu. So Kano spends the next 20 years or so fixing those objectives, he and his key instructor group. So judo, as it's rolled out later, really doesn't get fully formed until much later, in the early 20th century. So Kano later writes that the core of judo is kimi no kata, which is the most jujutsu-like of the kata. It's severe fighting, joint locks, breaks, strikes, kicks. There's very little judo about it, but he says this is really the core of the true judo. But his eventual vision was not only would judo take over the world, he would take over kinjutsu. He had a plan that he kept pretty well hidden, but he had a plan to take over everything and was well on his way to do it. And he came closer than people realized for having assumed the mantle of leadership over kendo and judo with auxiliary koryu and naginata-do. He died before he could get that done, but even after he passed away, there was almost a situation that was set up where it almost happened after his death, where the Kodokan would become the head of all Budo in Japan. So that was his original plan. Original plan. That's how his plan developed, and that he thought that he would be able to use that, since he was a superior educator, to use that as a way to educate young minds, and mind and spirit, body. Right?
Don't you think that, I mean, you're probably very well qualified for this question. Don't you think that the fact that Judo after the war got disconnected, not completely, but in comparison to before the war, it was disconnected on a large scale from actual politic decision making? Meaning that before the war, Budo was highly regarded as something extremely important, culturally speaking. probably thanks to Kano Sensei on the educational side, but also maybe people like Ueshiba teaching to the military and so on, and many Koryu, of course. But after the war, slowly it got disconnected to the point today. Budo is pretty much nothing in Japan. It's there is the Budo Kyoiku that they put in place 10 years ago, but I mean they're doing nothing with it, so it makes no sense. The population in Kendo, Judo, Cardio, it's dropping super fast, and Koryu are dying out. Don't you think that it might be because of the occupation? First, the fact that they cut all ties, but dismantled actually the Dai Nippon Butokukai and worked on cutting ties between martial arts and politicians.
Yes.
And maybe even later on, not from the military itself, but from the American culture that put people aside from like the old martial culture and maybe pushed them on different cultural paths.
Yes.
What could actually be called American soft power? Today we talk about Japan's soft power, you know, in America or in Europe. But at the time, it feels like it was reversed. It was American soft power that changed Japan.
This is a very complex situation. It is, at the first level, it is what you say. But even that first level is not simple. What Kano did was, in trying to get Judo, and he was not greedy, he didn't want to control all of physical education in Japan with Judo. He wanted to do it with Kendo. But remember that there was no organizing body for Kendo. There was the Dai Nihon Butokukai, which was patronized by an imperial prince and was under the auspices of the Ministry of Education. What Kano did was genius. He was an organizational genius. He's also in a position to take advantage of his ideas for organization. As the principal of the Tokyo Higher Normal School, he had under him the premier teachers that would go out to the major schools or to the prefectural normal schools to become teachers there. So he was in a position to salt his favorite Judo and Kendo physical education teachers into schools. He couldn't get Judo into the school curriculum, but he could send a physical education teacher who was qualified to teach Judo, who could then teach Judo as a sport, as a club sport, after hours. It wasn't part of the curriculum during the day, but they could be there and he would make sure that they would open a dojo and teach Judo. So he had these people salted all over Japan. So when it became a mandatory subject, they were able to just start teaching Judo during school hours. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to make it part of the core curriculum, not as a club sport, which is an after-school event that's organized separately. So he was able to pre-position these people in key places all over the country as the public education system expanded. And Kano's idea was almost like a secular religion. He had some notions that undergo various changes from around 1922. He retires in 1920. He's severely diabetic. If you look at his pictures, he always sits like this with his thighs apart because he had fat little thighs. He had huge thigh muscles and he was fat on top of that. So if you can look, in his 40s and 50s, he balloons up, his neck's quite big. So he had diabetes. It ends up killing him. But he wants to teach what he comes down to the say is Seiryoku Zenryo Jita Kyoe. And he keeps repeating this time after time after time So in my research, I've actually found where that came from. He never claimed to have said it himself or invented it himself. He said it was the invention of another person. He never says who it is, but I figured out where it came from. That's his idea. So Judo focuses on that, but what they don't disclose is all around that, he's a very staunch imperialist. He's very supportive of the imperial household. He's supportive of the empire. He's supportive of Japan having a strong military. He's not supportive of war itself because he thought that was a waste of time, assets, and that people should be able to get along. Adults in a civilized society should be able to get along. But if they couldn't get along, Kano wanted to win in a big way. If it came to war, he wanted to win, but he didn't want to get to war. So he's much more complex and nuanced. That the people at the time thought he was a very right-wing, very hardliner right-wing, but he was surrounded by people who were much more flamboyantly so than him. So he was relatively reasonable, but I think that history has been hidden by post-war Japanese. But in this concept, martial arts teachers in Kano's mind, and in the mind of the Ministry of Education and everyone else, they had a role to forge the body and the spirit. Shinshin Tanren. So you see the term tanren, which means to forge, like to hammer out a sword. Tanren. You're forging the mind and spirit. And the strangest thing is, it doesn't start with Budo. It kind of starts with Japanese baseball. So Japanese baseball becomes this incredibly grueling practice, and it's almost in reaction that the Budo people picked that up. Now, there were dojos that would do 1,000 cuts a day and things like that, and they existed for some time before. But in terms of this whole shugyo, where the full man, you must cut your hair, you must wear this, you must act like this, you can't do this. That kind of comes from Japanese baseball, which is a very strange aspect of Budo, I think, that is misunderstood. But remember, these people are in competition. The people being the Budo instructors and the baseball coaches, they're in competition for the best young men they can get, right? So they want to have these young men. So all of a sudden the Budo instructor sees the baseball guys running sprints all day. Well, we're going to run up and down the hill too. So there's this very strange interaction between what you rightfully say is a Western influence, American soft power, but it becomes a Japanese. They modify it to become Japanese. But as the war comes along, in the 1930s, as the tensions raise with China, there's a very complex relationship between the military, the Ministry of Education, the school system, martial arts, sports.
Because young people had to be prepared for war.
They had to be prepared for war. So as early as 1916, Kano writes of preparedness, what it takes. Why? Because they were studying the total mobilization systems in Europe, where the French and the Germans had different systems, but they had taught in the schools, they had taught young men how to do these things, how to do basic military drill, how to answer orders, how to handle a weapon, how to respond, how to toughen themselves up. So there's an arrangement made after World War I between the Japanese Army and the Ministry of Education that they're going to start including military education in the schools. Okay? And as the influence of the military increases, the threat to the martial arts increases too. As the military says, these silly things that you're doing, kendo with a bamboo stick and dogu, what is that? It's worthless on the battlefield. Judo is worthless on the battlefield. The way you teach it is all wrong. So they've come under threat, literally, because the military is negotiating with the Ministry of Education as to how many hours per week are allocated in the standard lesson courses. So when I started studying judo, I'd see Kano on the one hand saying that Seiryoku Zenryo Jita Kyoe. It's usually mistranslated. Kano's source translates a different way, but we'll just use that. Best use of energy, you and I both benefit. Okay? But if you look at many of the judo books of the period, and I started with one, I think I have collected every single judo education book written between 1900 and 1945, and you see this progression where it becomes increasingly warlike, and it kind of embodied in this 1938 book where martial arts is now mandatory for any able-bodied young man. Women are doing naginata do, but any young man is either doing kendo or judo. And if you look at this book, the judo looks like karate do, and the kendo looks like sword combat. They don't even put on a mask until the 4th semester of the 2-year program. So it's 2 semesters, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the 2nd year. And judo is all about fighting against knife attack, fighting against sword attack, punch, kick. It looks like karate do. So they don't need karate do in World War II, they've got judo. Judo goes through multiple changes over its course. The Kodokan doesn't recognize this. To go back to your original question.
Yet, just on that point, the Kodokan never got absorbed by the Dainippon Butokukai, which could have happened, but the Kodokan fought to stay outside of the Dainippon Butokukai, and both had their judo groups. So there was a time there was like militaristic judo on the one side and another more Kano-like judo on the Kodokan, or what was the dynamic between the two?
So I think this has been misunderstood and misrepresented in Western languages. It's more complex than that. The Dainihon Butokukai accepted Kano as a managing director very early on. He edited their magazine for several years with Nitobe, who worked for Kano. They were the editors of the magazine. So all of the articles, and if you look at it, it's not about martial arts. It's about current events. It's about military naval power, technology advances in aircraft engines, events on the continent. What are the French and Germans doing now? How do you prepare for total war? That's what they're editing. That's what's in there. What does happen is that one of Kano's key men goes to run the judo division, and they start promoting people separately from the Kodokan. Kano wanted to control everything. He was described by one of his long-term interlocutors and partners in the education field as the most stubborn man in Japan. He just says it outright. If he got his way, he was happy. If he didn't get his way, no one was happy because he never stopped complaining. He would always try to control everything. He wanted to control the promotions. And the Butokukai was not only giving promotions separately, Dan promotions, they were also giving shogo. But Kano had a shogo from the Dainihon Butokukai. He's judo hanshi, right? So he has rank in the Butokukai. So it becomes a small, almost a made-up controversy. And Kano says, there is no difference between us. And some of the post-war misunderstanding is that the Dainihon Butokukai is shut down by the Japanese. It's shut down by the wartime government and replaced by a new Dainihon Butokukai.
Oh, but there are 10 years between the two. So.
You
mean before the war?
Just before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, okay.
So
it's a continuous evolution of...
Right, but it's it's not only the Dai Nihon Butokukai, but also the Kodokan is experimenting with combat techniques. I've found the records where people talk about studying one-touch death in the Kodokan, how to fight Jisen Judo, true combat judo. Why? Because once again, all of their instructors at the schools are under pressure, or not directly, but through the Ministry of Education, to reduce the number of hours in these worthless prancing around with a bamboo sword and playing at judo. So the children's judo becomes more and more combat judo oriented. Kano was against that sort of thing, but he couldn't fight it. There's a whole complex scenario where an event where he is pushing back against the Ministry of Education, and he's almost thrown off the board of the Kodokan. There's a revolution inside the Kodokan where the board members want to do what the Ministry of Education is saying. Kano is almost voted off the board in his own Kodokan. And after that, he changes his tune. He changes his attitude, and he's more accepting of this. Part of that manifestation is he puts a kamidana in the Kodokan for the first time. He had resisted it, saying it's not a religious organization, it's a scientific organization, and it shouldn't be used to proselytize Shinto, even though there are stories that he practiced a sort of Shinto himself. He certainly attended Shinto events. His family was steeped in Shinto. His personal family was Buddhist. He was not religious in the normal sense, but he fought against that, and then he turned after this revolution. So in the occupation, Budo becomes a topic in the occupation, and I interviewed the last person alive that participated in those negotiations. So a year and a half after the occupation starts, the occupation gets around to looking at the Dai Nihon Butokukai, the new one that was reestablished. They shut down the old one, which is headquartered in Kyoto. The offices were near the Butoku-den, which still exists. But they established a new one, and the new Butokukai was put under the Home Ministry, which was responsible for all police, assigned the governors. There were no elections for governors or mayors of major cities. They were assigned. They were Home Ministry bureaucrats. The police were Home Ministry bureaucrats under that organization. So it was a very powerful internal ministry that patterned itself after secret home ministries in France and Germany and everything else. So the head of this is Tojo Hideki, who's a Kinjutsuka, who also practiced Jujutsu in Manchuria. And all of the ministers of health, army, navy, war, they're all vice chairman. So about a year and a half after the occupation, GHQ turns its attention to the Dai Nihon Butokukai. So people were still practicing, right? And remember that MacArthur never took over Japan. That doesn't explain the complexity of it. The original thought of MacArthur was to have a military government. So each city would have some U.S. Army officer in charge of it. They would have U.S. Army officers running the Bank of Japan. They had these economic experts, industrial experts, cultural experts, education experts. When he got to Japan, he was convinced that the Japanese would be better, that he and the Japanese would be better served by leaving the government in place, but they would advise the Japanese government. So what was to be the military government became what's called the government section of GHQ. So they had their counterparts. They all sat in one place in Marunouchi at the Daiichi Seimei, #1 life insurance building, but they would go see their counterparts in the Ministry of Economy or have them come see them. I mean, they'd tell the Prime Minister, come, somebody wants to talk to you. The Prime Minister would go over and get his instructions. And they would go try to figure out how to do it legally under the Japanese Constitution. And they'd have some negotiations because they didn't want to just ignore the Constitution. So around a year and a half after the occupation starts, they look at Budo. And Budo is still being taught in schools to the extent that there are schools. I mean, remember that everything has come apart. There are no jobs, there's no food. Refugees are pouring into Tokyo trying to get a handout from the occupation forces because they don't have anything out in the country. The Allies tried to bomb the place into oblivion. So trains don't work. People can't get raw materials. So Budo's not high on the list. And they get around to it. And there's a young lieutenant in the GHQ who's given the job to go deal with the Butokukai. And I found him and I interviewed him years ago. He has since passed away. Lovely gentleman. And I said, is this an important policy for GHQ? He said, Lance, I was a first lieutenant. Like that's how I was a 22-year-old U.S. Army officer. That's how unimportant it was to the occupation. In fact, they were negotiating with the Home Ministry. Remember that now the new Butokukai is under the Home Ministry, and there's a staff inside the Home Ministry, Naimusho. And they're negotiating with them, and he says, here's a list of 12 reforms. If you do this, you can continue. We don't care. The Butoku, we think it's kind of an interesting cultural event. We're the U.S. Army, GHQ, MacArthur doesn't care. You guys go do it. Onoha, Itoryu. Do whatever you want, but you're not going to do this. What you're not going to do is talk about teaching the spirit. You're not going to exalt the emperor. You're not going to make it warlike. You're not going to do these 12 things. So there's a group of Japanese who come in and say, from the Naimusho, who take this and they look at it and say, thank you very much. They go back. Now, here's this young lieutenant. He's fully expecting that they're going to do the reforms in order to keep Budo alive all over Japan. And they come back later that week and say, thank you for this. We're not going to reform anything. We quit. We're going to shut it down. They don't want to reform anything. And everybody's surprised. So he's in there with the Ministry of Education officials and the GHQ trying to negotiate this. They think they've done them a great favor. And why do they shut it down? Because the second Dainihon Butokukai was really all about preparing for war. All of the senior leadership of the Dainihon Butokukai had been arrested as Class A war criminals. Tojo Hideki, Araki Sadao, all of these guys are now arrested. They're sitting at Sagamo prison. The bureaucrats in the Homosho have better things to do. They say, we're just going to disband. Well, GHQ gets mad and says, all right, we're going to shut you down. You're not going to disband, we're going to shut you down. So they only promulgate the order to shut it down later. And then the Budo ban comes along. The Budo ban was only really for public training, schools, public halls, public facilities like gymnasiums. Mostly,
we know that Moscow Budo didn't really stop practicing.
They didn't stop. GHQ didn't care. Okay, so there's this big disconnect, but people say there's a Budo ban, but it wasn't a total ban. It was a ban on teaching the not traditional martial arts, but the new martial arts that had been invented to support the war effort. Using that as militaristic training, that was what was forbidden. But think, all of these people who made their living doing that in schools are now out of a job. The Kodokan never closed. After the Budo ban, they never closed. They never closed the Kodokan. But once they put the ban in place, it was flooded with children from different schools and their teachers who would come, and they could practice at the Kodokan. They couldn't practice in a public facility like a school. So my instructor said it was so crowded after the war that you couldn't fall down. You had to walk around and kind of try to sweep feet, but you really couldn't take a full ukemi, that the main dojo was so full of people because all of the smaller dojos in the public facilities had been shut down. So a group of Japanese senior kendo guys, judo guys, and Naginata Federation ladies went to GHQ, and I found the memo. I have the memo of the meeting. And they said, well, we would really like to teach Budo. And there was a young U.S. Army officer who said, okay, that's fine with us. Teach away. They said, but you don't want to do it this way. You don't want to have this militaristic training. We've been doing this for 15, 20 years now. What do we do? And he said, I don't know. Make it a sport. And I said, how do we do that? He said, I don't know. Make points or something. You guys can figure that out. You're smart. So they went off and they recreated Budo one more time. That's the disconnect. So the people who had spent their lives and careers knowing that and teaching that Budo was to train the mind-body connection in service of the emperor to become a better imperial subject, now had to make it a sport. And they didn't have a basis for it. There was no intellectual or moral or ethical basis for Budo. So there's a gigantic disconnect between pre-war Budo Bushido. It's tightly integrated with the education system and the imperial household considerations, if not worship, and post-war where all of those traditional ties are cut and it becomes a standalone sport. And that's where I think, where you say it's lost from its moorings. People don't understand how that happened. So I met a lot of the old masters who were trained in that period, and they always wanted to, you get the impression they want to talk about that, but they didn't understand it particularly well because they were young people, right? Well, they know it's kind of Budo, kind of Bushido, and it's really important that you work real hard, and the emperor's in there someplace, and in post-war they can't talk about that at all if they want to make a living, because for many of them they can't do anything else. So GHQ gets mad at the Dai Nihon Butokukai and wants to ban every officer of the Dai Nihon Butokukai from holding public office forever. They're going to ban the entire roster. The Prime Minister himself goes to the number one under MacArthur, the head of the government section. He says, please don't do this. Please don't do this. And they ask why. He said, every governor, every chief of police, every able-bodied member of the Diet is a member of the Dai Nihon Butokukai. If you do this, we cannot run the government tomorrow. Give us, work with us. We'll identify the bad people and we'll ban them, but you can't ban everybody. So meanwhile, all of the police, all of these people, they know this is going on. Everything is being leaked to everybody. So they're panicked about this. And all of these stories come out with the GHQ wanted to wipe out, the Dai Nihon Butokukai. Well, the Dai Nihon Butokukai actually dissolved before GHQ banned it. And then they said, we're going to ban everybody for life from public office, which meant, as the Prime Minister said, I'm a member. He said, I'm a member. I mean, all my cabinet, they're all members, all the governors, everything. The country will stop. It will be ungovernable if you do this. So what they did was go through and identified key people, and it went through governors were banned. And of all of these people, there's one judo instructor who ends up being banned because he was a functionary in one of the prefectural Dai Nihon Butokuden and he had done some other things. But all of a sudden, all these people are out of jobs. So some of them end up going overseas. They have no other functions. But also, and I'm working on a project that we'll disclose within the year on how all this worked together. But remember that here's the Army teaching in every school. They have active duty military officers in the division level or prefectures who have retired officers and non-commissioned officers teaching military art in every school in Japan. But they're also kendo people. So
Of course.
all of a sudden the kendo gets absorbed into the Army because the Army guys love kendo. So the real driving force behind kendo is not what people like to say today, that there was the organizations that did this, and yeah, the Army did some things. The Army drove kendo for generations. They were the head. Kano's counterpart in kendo was usually a senior Army officer, because there was no capstone organization other than the Butokukai, which was headed by retired military officers for many, many years after a scandal in which a civilian was arrested for a bribery scandal, some stock manipulation. So certainly GHQ has a huge impact on it, but some of it is self-inflicted by the Japanese. They wouldn't reform. The Dai Nihon Butokukai would exist today. There is an organization that calls itself the Dai Nihon Butokukai. It has no connection to the original. It was dissolved. It was banned by GHQ, and all of the funds were returned to the National Treasury. I think the group in Kyoto got a little bit of money from the government. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, of course. And the group, no, in Kyoto, they got some money from the Imperial family because they still have the patronage of the Imperial family. So that's how it started, I think.
Prince Fushimi?
Yeah.
He was the head of one of the cadet branches of the Imperial family. That whole system was dropped under the new constitution. So yes, they have that imprimatur. When I joined the International Martial Arts Federation, our chairman was Prince Higashikuni, who was the lieutenant general in the Imperial Army. He was a Kendoka, and he was the only member of the Imperial family ever to be prime minister. And I met him several times. I didn't know his history. There's little old gent with some interesting glasses. But he was the one member, I believe, of the Imperial family arrested for war crimes as a warning and then released. So he was a controversial figure, but he was supportive of the martial arts and of our organization. And they supported him too. I mean, it was a mutual aid pact, I believe, between them. So yes, they do have the patronage of that person, but at the time, our Martial Arts Federation, all of our promotion certificates had the prince's seal on it, the 15-petal chrysanthemum. The emperor has six, I always get it wrong, backwards.
Yeah, 15.
Emperor is 16 and the prince is, one of the princes is 15. But anyway, the old certificates under which I was originally promoted had the imperial seal. We had that, and we gave shogo. We had permission from the imperial household, from that branch of the imperial family, to give the honorary titles. So there is a connection. Yeah, there are connections like that. But you could imagine the dysfunctionality of the situation where these people, these are rock stars, like Mifune Sensei in the Kodokan, taught in like a half a dozen places. Any given day, he was all over the city. They got good money. They were well paid. There was a very interesting setup where the Ministry of Education allowed certain people who had prior military service to become physical education instructors. And many of them did kendo because they were mostly Army infantry types, and they did kendo. So, you know, he's teaching phys ed one hour, and then he's a kendo guy. And then the Army guys that are with him, they come in and they do kendo together. So the impact of the military on martial arts is very strong, particularly for kendo, particularly in the education system. And that's where I was lucky to be able to piece these things together from the actual laws, the education laws, the development of the education system, Kano's influence on that, the military's influence on that, and how they negotiated back and forth. And I actually have a quote from one of Kano's senior students saying, in the early days of World War II, without Kano, we would have never been able to build this education system which gave us such a strong basis to launch our military into this conflict.
how I think you've seen how Japanese police and military train too.
Yes.
Judo or worse, Aikido. I taught a class to the Japanese police here in Japan. It's terrible. The level is really, really poor. And it's clearly not usable, even for policemen. It's certainly not usable for war, but not even usable for daily police duty. And why? Education. So they only kept the educational part, or sports, but it seems to be no longer connected with militaristic thinking in the sense of being usable for war or police duty at all.
Okay, so I would change the adjective from militaristic to practical.
Yeah, practical.
Okay, is that fair?
Yeah, it works for both police.
Right. So militaristic is more about the feeling I'm aggressive or we're regimented, but I'd say practical, jisen,
sure.
real combat. There are pockets, pretty well hidden, in the Japanese government of realistic combat type hand-to-hand training. You can see some places you can't go. You have to be invited.
Kido Tai training camp, maybe? Or?
Kido Tai is a bit more realistic. Okay. The Kogu Keisatsu, the Imperial Guards Police, they have a judo training program. I was invited to visit the Saine-kan, which is the martial arts dojo inside the Imperial Palace by the then Crown Prince, the current Emperor. And they gave me a demonstration. It turns out I knew the Shihan of the judo program from the Kodokan. I didn't realize who he was, and he didn't have his glasses on, and we got close enough to shake hands, and he went, I know you. Why are you coming here at the Crown Prince? But, well, at the Crown Prince's invitation, and I explained, through a mutual friend, I had requested it, and they granted it. So they had some pretty tough boys. There are some prison guard programs, well hidden from sight, that are pretty tough. But the judo, the post-war judo, doesn't do any of that. It's not meant to be jisen. It's meant to be within the bounds of the sport and under which judo was reformed post-war. There are people who take those techniques and will apply them into real hand-to-hand, real dangerous situations.
How is the modern judo different from Kano's original idea of making it an educational tool?
How is it?
Yeah, how is it different?
Okay, so...
Because it is still an educational tool today, adapted to the modern world.
You could say that. The Kodokan would certainly like to think that. At some level, the International Judo Federation pays lip service to that notion that it's an education. But they're really about sport. It's a sport. So you could say that any sport is an educational tool. It teaches you to be a better person, to take care of your hygiene. Kano wanted it to be at various levels. And he actually writes about this. And I translated this, I think it's the first time any non-Japanese speaker has ever seen it, is when I translated it into English, the 12 precepts of judo. And at the basic level, he teaches judo as physical education and how to attack and defend. He repeats this phrase, attack and defend, and he's serious about that. He believes that a whole well-rounded person should be able to attack someone or defend against someone's attack. It's not just defense, but it's also attack and defend. And when he talks about the Kimi no Kata as being the core of judo, it can be very offensive. offensive in the sense of I attack you. I don't wait for you to attack. But if you look at most Japanese martial arts, they are defensive. Your opponent cuts and you counter. You wait for the initial attack and you counter.
Well, usually the defensive martial arts are those you cannot use, practically speaking.
But even the sword arts, Jodo is always someone attacks you and you defend. They commit to an attack and you defend. In Karate-do, most of the kata are defenses with an attack or a counterattack, a block. In Onoha Itoryu, is it not the same? Someone cuts at you and and then you counter, right?
But this is a discussion that has been around in Aikido for like 50 years. I mean, since the founder passed, that's the main discussion topic. Is Aikido a defensive art or self-defense or whatever? But well, it's an opinion because not everyone thinks the same way, of course. But to me, it feels like in Aikido, if you defend, you lose. You have to attack if you want to win. You have to attack first. And the one thing the founder said, which is to me the most important thing in Aikido, is you have to catch the intention and attack first. So you can say he attacked first because I knew he was about to attack when I attacked. But okay, factually speaking, you have to attack first if you want to win. And saying that, then you cannot say that Aikido is self-defense. And you cannot say, I think that most Budo are self-defense. If you want to use them as Budo, as sports or modern ways of education or whatever, maybe. But true Budo actually cannot be about defense. It has to be about attack. Defense, yes, because you have to have a partner that will defend against your attack. But the essence of Budo, to me, is not defense. It's attack. And that's very hard to say in the Budo world because, especially nowadays, people want to hear that Budo is just a mean of defense and they're not aggressive and they want to see the world, through the 21st century moral framework. But it doesn't work this way, I think.
So,
what about Judo, actually? In your opinion?
Well, in Judo, Judo rewards the aggressor, as does Kendo. So if you're pointing, the aggressor is awarded. If you're matched in points. In the old days, it wouldn't necessarily have a golden score or have overtime. They would reward the match to the aggressor, the person who attacks. Because in attacking, you present weaknesses that can be exploited by a capable opponent. One of the most interesting things that I've done in Budo is learn about sin no sin, sin no sin, and seeing someone who's truly a sword master demonstrate that and do it flawlessly time after time after time with people who think they're very advanced, but he's able to always detect when they're about to strike. I can do it, on a good day, I can do it 70, 80% of the time, and he'll do it 100% of the time. He'll strike before you realize you're going to attack. And I've literally seen very advanced EI practitioners fall down from surprise just by his motion. That's when someone is really perceptive. They understand what they're looking at. It's very interesting practice. But in Judo, what most of the police and everybody else is learning is essentially the basics of sport Judo within certain parameters. So what Kano did was create a Judo that you could practice at full speed safely. But in responding to those criticisms from the early 1890s, I believe it was, where the Ministry of Education was considering putting Kinjutsu and Jujutsu into the education system as physical exercise, they criticized finger techniques, wrist techniques, shoulder, eye gouges, and things like that. So Kano and his team of experts reduced all of those techniques so they could do gross body movement safely at full speed. And I think what Kano was impressed about Aikido with Ueshiba Morihei sensei was that they could include wrist techniques, whereas they had dropped them from Judo. And I think Kano was very impressed by that. Also, you could, in Aikido, you might take the back of the head and guide someone over. You can't do that in Judo. That was one of the criticisms, that you could damage the neck. So he looked at Aikido, full blast, practice safely, wrist and everything. And that's why I believe that Kano said, now that's my perfect Budo.
Yes, actually, I would have said the exact same thing. It's not that he thought that Aikido was better than Judo. It's just because he was, maybe he had some regrets that he had to take away those techniques from his own Judo to make it an education, means to ensure that he would get Judo into the education system.
He certainly had to make compromises. And I think that those compromises inform us of what he meant by calling Aikido perhaps a perfect Budo, that he understood what Ueshiba Morihei was saying. Their thoughts about the philosophies behind it were very different. But I think so the connection was at the physical exercise level. So what Kano wanted to see was people moving, constant movement, never fighting strength against strength unless you had to. People misunderstand it. And on my blog site, the Kano Chronicles, on there I translate the ancient Chinese term that leads to the modern saying that softness overcomes strength. And it's part of a very long Chinese treatise on strategy. But within that, it actually talks about the use of softness where appropriate, the use of hardness where appropriate. So Judo is not only the gentle art, gentleness overcomes strength, but also when you have to be hard, be hard. And Kano wrote of this, and he talks about it. If you're in a bear hug, if someone has you in a bear hug, they're behind you, you can't gentle your way out of it. You have to focus all of your strength, and you focus it to the weak point. But the preferred answer in Judo should be gentleness. And he doesn't mean gentle, and people misunderstand it, I think. He doesn't mean gentle like softness. He means gentle like pliable, gentle like not force against force. You give way, and that helps steal your opponent's balance. So what he wanted to see was constant movement, circular movement, this softness. Someone pushes, you don't fight, you withdraw. He would get very angry when he'd see young men fighting against each other. And he'd call it like two bulls fighting in the, there's no technique to it. There's no superior thought to it. It's just strength against strength.
Isn't that what he did his whole life? Fighting against the Japanese government to get Judo into the educational system. Okay, this is the point you have against my Judo? I found a way around it. And isn't that what he did his whole life, actually, practicing Judo outside of the dojo?
Well, he certainly did. He had a plan for most everything. He was never, almost never threatened by people who had other ways of martial arts. He loved other martial arts. He wrote forwards to many, many martial arts books for Koryu and Kendo and other things. He was very supportive of Kendo. Wasn't threatened by it at all. In fact, as I said, he planned to absorb it all. And so his way was to roll into town and say, Jordy, you have a great jujutsu practice here in Kumamoto. But what he did was set up the system around it so he controlled the rules of the competitions. So if you wanted to show up to a judo competition, you had to learn what those rules were, and your children, your students, had to fight by those rules. So eventually, you only have so many hours in a week, right, to train. So over time, they would start to teach judo instead of their own jujutsu. And then he would come to them and say, you're really good. You have a very good program. You'll have more kids come your way if you're a Kodokan black belt, and I'll make you a second dan or a third dan. He'd promote them on the spot, give them a belt, give them a book, and say, now you teach judo. He didn't fight them. He would absorb them. So he absorbed almost all the, this is when Koryu Jujutsu in Japan just kind of evaporated over a couple of generations because of what Kano did.
That's crazy. We have like Daito-ryu, Takeno-ichi-ryu, a few left, but in comparison to Iai and Kenjutsu, Jujutsu is there's almost nothing left.
There are very few left. My sensei's sensei said that there were like 330 Koryu Jujutsu schools, and then now we're down to a handful, 15, 20, I don't know. And some of them are, you wonder if some of them are recreations, some of them are actually transmitted. I practiced Takeuchi-ryu for several years. Had to quit because of judo. I had to run the dojo. And that's taught by the same family since 1534, documented. But, you know, they have 984 techniques, I think it is. I always forget. It's almost 1,000 techniques. So someone would eventually learn them all. One of my Budo senpai actually had his brother, the head of their clan, the head of their family, adopt me into their family. And he was part of Jigenryu down in Satsuma in Kyushu. And he was in the last traditional juku in Japan, as far as I know. And they would bring in young men who would start at a very early age, they'd start a martial arts. But the instructor would go, you're tall and lanky, you're a spear guy. You're short and stubby, you're going to use the short sword. And they would become the shihan of the school. They would practice for 3-4 years, get a teaching certificate, and then they never learned the entire curriculum of the school. They would specialize with certain weapons or techniques inside the school. So this notion that someone would come in and they'd learn from technique 1 to technique 1000, very few people that ever did that. So I believe that they were specialized within that. They were part of the school, but they would be the sword specialists. They would be familiar with short sword, dagger, jujutsu techniques, but maybe they would specialize in naginata, specialize in long pole arms, short arms, or whatever. But now, you know, it's fun. It's great fun for if you have the body for it, if you can adapt. And you know, Tengu Jujutsu, when we jumping up and running around, I didn't do that very well. I did some of the other stuff, okay, but I think that is a misunderstanding of being a member of a school. Maybe they only have it. And my sensei would tell of his sensei's original documents saying that even like a bow and arrow school would have 4 or 5 jujutsu moves. Why? Because if someone closes with you and grabs your bow, how do you fight back? How do you release your bow? They had to know that, and they'd have 2 or 3 knife counter attacks, or using the bow as a cudgel and, you know, stabbing someone in the eye with it. So a lot of those have disappeared, particularly since now, many of the, as you mentioned, many of the practitioners of Koryu are much older. Even though the schools originally had some jujutsu subset, most 70-year-old Japanese men who started in their 50s, maybe after, you know, close to retirement, they're not going to roll around on a hardwood floor and do jujutsu. So after a generation, it disappears. So how much has been lost? It's impossible to tell. But Kano loved the old style Koryu, and he actually had a special research dojo in the Kodokan where he brought in experts in Koryu. And his notion was eventually it would all become part of the world of the Kodokan.
Going forward in the education part of judo, which is the big part, what about you? So you started did judo for quite a while now, and you're studying Kano and history. which means you have a deep interest in Judo as a Budo, but also as a historical part. So you have how do you say that? A broad vision of Judo, not only the sport. How did or does the Judo practice, your Judo practice, changed or is still changing the way you live, the way you work, the way you communicate with people?
Well, first off, there are very few people that see Judo as a martial art in Japan. They pay lip service to it. They say Judo is both a sport and a martial art. But the way we approach Judo traditionally in our dojo was much more as a martial art than as a sport. And this was a surprise to the people that I meet in Japan who are advanced Judo people. Most of them have never met anyone like that, literally. In fact, I'm a member of the Shinagawa-ku Judo Association. And Shinagawa is one of the larger ones in the city of Tokyo. And I remember one day one of the senior directors came to me and said, "You really do think that Judo is a martial art, don't you?" And it was a surprise to him. And he said, I have to really think about that, because they see it as a sport that has the tradition of being a martial art. This year I became a director of the Tokyo Judo Federation. It's the biggest one in Japan. 13,000 black belts and probably another 40 or 50,000 people who study under them. And there's one other foreigner, a young German woman, who was put on the women's the promotion committee for women to get more women into Judo. And I'm advisor to the chairman and a member of the international committee, new international committee. They want to increase international exchanges, but I'm working on a number of things with them. And they don't see it as a martial art. They do see it as something you can train and have fun. But my sensei, as I said earlier, he had a split with a Kodokan, an argument over a succession of this martial arts federation to which he became the director. He taught Judo as a martial art. I primarily went for the Jujutsu. I wasn't interested in Judo until I saw him. And he could demonstrate the subtleties and the beauty of Judo in a way that you can't see in sport Judo. And how he moved, the things he could do with his body in his 50s and 60s that I could never do. And I met him when I was in my 30s. And I was pretty fit. I mean, I was a young military officer, so we were fit. But he could do things that I couldn't imagine. It was a combination of flexibility, strength, endurance, but technique after technique. And he could demonstrate Judo in a way that made it so interesting and so powerful, appealing, that I became very much an adherent of that type of Judo. But it's very rare. There are organizations in America and Europe that are trying to perpetuate that. And I think most of them aspire to something along the lines of what Kano wanted to see. He didn't want to see force against force. He wanted to see you use the minimum force, giving way to take advantage of your opponent. If you had to finish, to add strength. But for most people, if you're going to compete in Judo, you're pretty much gone from true competitive Judo at late 20s, early 30s. Now there are master's programs, but Kano wrote in the 1920s of the difficulties of teaching 50-year-olds how to do Judo. And I have students that start at 50 and 60 years old. My oldest student is 70. My youngest is 5 or 6. And what we do is teach the techniques and try to get everyone to have an appreciation of this possibility that without confrontation, you can yield, you can win by yielding. If you keep your balance and your stability, you can win by yielding. You can use your opponent's strength against you. And it's interesting to see what the children come up with. One day, an 8-year-old young American girl asked me, "Why are you so nice to people and then you choke them?" I said, "Well, we're trying to get them trained to the point where they're interesting to choke. But if we start choking them right away, they won't come back." She goes, "Oh, I can understand that." But we're just learning how. We don't want to do this to anybody. And so some of the kindest people I know are these giant judo guys. They don't have anything to prove. They're huge. They're muscled. You know, we have an instructor class in Tokyo. Some days I'm the only Westerner there, and there are 300 people in there. And I realize I'm not the biggest guy by any stretch. There might be 30 young men bigger than me. Probably 100 of them could kill me without breaking sweat. Another 100 would have to sweat to kill me. And I might be able to fight off another, the weakest 100. I might have a good day of it. But there's no aggression to it once they get past a certain point. And that comes kind of naturally. But what Kana wanted to see was you understanding that first you have to master yourself. You're not trying to beat anybody. You're just trying to be a better human. Get better. And then once you get to a certain point, beyond the personal judo, you have the dojo judo, where you can enough that you can help someone else become a better person. And in this process, they'll understand that they can be better, both physically and spiritually, by not fighting, by cooperating, working with one another. Even though you're working on these techniques that could be very dangerous or deadly even. And then at the third level, you would take these teachings out to the broader society, that you would react to instances in your life by understanding that we must give to get along. I cannot fight this. My strength will eventually wane. If I fight long enough, my endurance will lapse, or I get older and my power and my speed go down. And eventually someone younger and stronger and faster will come and beat me. But if I work with society, we'll realize that it's give and take, that we both have to compromise in order to do better. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I would just extend the question to how does that translate in your job? I mean, everyday job. What kind of challenges do you face, and how do you solve them? You are an advisor, so you are advising Japanese people, and Japanese people are not, I want to say, not very good listeners, but they listen. They just don't integrate what you're saying. But I mean, how do you overcome those challenges you have advising Japanese people? Because if you advise and they don't listen, well, it's pointless. So
one way is to observe the situation. Try to understand the true situation before you try to affect it. Japanese culture is very different from American culture. Actually, I find that the Japanese like to deal with Americans because they find Americans very open. Now, if that's a good thing, I don't know. But they find them open in that we understand what you want. So in comparison, they find Europeans harder to understand. The British are more reserved. They're much more likely to have an agenda that they don't disclose. They find the Germans to be dry, very factually oriented, that, which they can understand, but they don't care for that. The French are somewhere in between. They're more complex. It may be harder to read. But if an American comes in and they tell you, this is what we want, and we want it now, they understand it, they're happy that that happens. So in my job, I advise foreign companies coming into the Japanese market, and sometimes these very complex sales may take years to make a sale, where we have to really understand what the customer wants, what they can afford, how do we deal with them back and forth. And when I was first here, I always wanted to win no matter what. I wanted to win because I wanted to prove to my customer or my employer that I knew what was going on. I could figure out a way to win. And over time, perhaps it was the Judo came along, or just worn down the sharp edges of my personality. Realize sometimes you're never going to win. You cannot win. So you cannot sacrifice the personal relationship knowing that you can't win. Don't worry about it. Sometimes you provide a service, a valuable reference to the Japanese customer just by being there, by providing them information, by helping them understand their own situation, even if they're going to do it internally. So typically what I'm trying to sell, there's a Japanese competitor, or I'm trying to convince a Japanese competitor to team with us on a project, to work together rather than work against each other. And when I lost, I resented it a great deal. After enough years, I realized the relationship should extend beyond win-lose this program. It should go longer. I need to understand them and appreciate them, that they have their own internal problems. They have to provide employment for their employees. They have to provide work for them. Sometimes they'll spend more money to build something that's not as functional as what I can sell them for less money. But they have reasons to do that. Now, are they good reasons? Not always. But they do have their reasons, and it helps to understand that. So it's giving way when appropriate. It's being hard when appropriate. So I think that appreciation has informed the way I deal with people. More patience, more willingness to suffer some short-term pain to get to a longer-term good solution. How about you? I'm sure you've found the same thing?
Yeah, well, I'd say that a question that I often have a hard time to answer, I hear a lot, is what is the specificity of Aikido, philosophically speaking? Is it different from Judo or Karate or whatever? I say, yes, I can feel that there is something specific to Aikido, but it's very hard to explain. And I've spent the past 5 to 10 years to try to locate that specific tiny part of Aikido that makes Aikido. And it's really difficult. But I think that the past years, what I understood from Aikido is it goes one step beyond only trying to, like, as you said, be patient and try to understand people and make them work together. It's this idea of how do I make the overall situation better? How do I make things one step forward better? And what does better means to me, and what does better means to the people I'm working with.
Right.
And we don't have the same definition. So where do we find this compromise? How do we solve this conflict? This is not a conflict that we don't work against each other. We work together, but we have slightly different goals. Because better doesn't mean the same thing for all of us. And that's a form of conflict that I think is technically within Aikido. We work together. We want the technique to work, but we don't see the technique the same way. We're not the same size, same weight, same age. We don't have the same teachers. We don't have the same preferences. I like this technique, you like this one. But we have to make both our techniques better. working together. And I think that's, at this point, my understanding of this higher philosophical value that we have in Aikido is this exact point, is even when we work together and we're sure that we're working together, there is always an element of conflict between people. Can be big conflict, very tiny conflict that you have to recognize if you want to really work toward a better situation for everyone. And I think it's incredibly complex. Like, technically speaking, practicing with people is technically extremely complex. And I have this feeling that you train, do the same techniques always and always. And one day it works. You feel that you're really moving forward, but you can't explain it. And that's my real problem. You know, I even in my personal life, I cannot explain precisely why it's working. But with training and thinking about martial arts in general and Aikido in specific, it's working. And I don't know, it's very, very hard to explain. But I definitely think that, and I'm going to ask you the question if you think the same right after that. I definitely think that Budo in itself, be it Aikido, Judo, Karate, or whatever, it doesn't help. It doesn't make people better. If you practice and think about what you're doing, then you have a chance to get better. But practicing alone, many people say, you just practice Judo, just practice Aikido, you see you become a better person. Well, look at how people are arguing on social networks or whatever. It doesn't make people better.
That's a funny version of getting better, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, getting better is, it's not my definition of getting better.
Right,
Maybe
right,
theirs, but not mine, actually.
Sure.
And no, I think you have to think about it. You have to read books, learn history. Budo is more than practice. It's a whole package. It's an educational tool, but I think it's a whole package. You have to be a budoka, a scholar, a philosopher. You have to add other qualities, studies to just Budo, or alone. Maybe in some ways, if taught properly, it can be a very efficient method for military or police, so probably. But as a mean of becoming a better person, this famous Ningenke no Michi, no, cannot be only technique. I don't know what you think, but that's my strong opinion.
Well, I think that you have many elements there. Let me break out two of them. One of them is that I think that Kano's original idea for Judo was much more aligned with what happens in the Aikikai or the Yoshinkan than what happens in sport Judo today. He wanted constant repetition. He wanted people to move. One person to attack, one person to offend, the other change the roles, constant practice, lots of falls. So the way we do it is first off, we make sure people can fall. We get them over a fear of falling and then try to do the technique slowly, gently. Some people never get over the fear of falling. If you can't get rid of the fear of falling, you'll never feel the shifts that happen, the subtle shifts that happen in your posture when Kazushi is applied. You'll never feel them, and you never move well. So we try to move fluidly, with as much movement as possible, with as little strength as possible. And then, as people build their technique and they can feel their opponent, then you add power and opposition. Tomiki Kenji Sensei, who's the founder of what's called Tomiki Ryu Aikido, was my sensei for Aikido, for Aiki Bujutsu. He taught the Imperial military police in Manchuria. He taught my sensei. He taught the U.S. Air Force after World War II. My sensei was one of the instructors in the program. Tomiki Tomiki Sensei's idea was that no one should take Aikido before they had 10 years of Judo.
I agree with that, actually.
10 years of strong Judo. Why? Because you build up to having a real live opponent that you're struggling against. And Kano thought that Judo was the best form of physical education because you exercise all of your muscles. And when you're fighting someone for real, everything is exhausted immediately. I mean, in 60 seconds, you're heaving, you're dying for oxygen, your muscles are screaming. And you can get that sort of workout. It's very difficult to get that sort of workout anyplace else. But you learn how to deal with a resisting opponent, and then you could add the subtleties of Aikido. He was never able to run a program like that. Tomiki Aikido starts from day one with Aikido.
I think the main problem we have with that is that at some point in Judo, as it became a sport, the small details just disappeared from practice because of the competitive aspect.
Right. You only have so many hours a day. Show me what I need to know to win.
And at the beginning in Judo, there was this Kano's genius. Let's make a system that works step by step. We never had that in Aikido. The founder of Aikido was a terrible teacher.
He was indeed.
He never taught, actually. He was practicing, showing stuff to people, and people was trying to imitate what he was doing. And he was an awful teacher. Yeah. So some people tried. I mean, Seido in Iwama or Tomiki did that a bit. Kobayashi in his own style. Many teachers, Tohei in Hawaii, and in Japan, but he brought that to Hawaii. Step by step, they tried to build something that made sense, but I think it was never as well made, as comprehensive than the Judo system.
Remembering that none of this happened in a vacuum. So my history pulls in the education policy, school teacher education, and I think that there's a false expectation that there is some magic definition of Budo, that someone understands it. And if you look at the history of Budo, it's much more complex. And it's not unified at all. The term Budo comes from a home ministry bureaucrat named Nishikubo, who was a kendo guy. And he was hugely fat. I mean, if you take his bogu off, he actually looked like that. I mean, he looked like he'd swallowed a basketball or a beach ball. He had this huge round gut. But he developed the term Budo, and he was trying to instill a martial attitude in the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. Why? When they started, they were all former samurai. But then when the new government really got rolling, they had to bring in commoners who had no martial arts background. So he began to standardize martial arts training, but he wanted to call it Budo. It would instill this martial arts spirit. What is that martial arts spirit? Well, this is where Bushido comes in. Okay? So Bushido in Japan, post-war, we're left with trying to figure out what is Bushido, what is Budo, what are these things that we call Budo, Bushido? But we've taken the underpinning out that is the sine qua non of them. The thing without which we cannot understand it is the entire imperial system. Okay? And that wasn't the way Japan started. It took them years to figure out, we're going to do this. But in 1890, I believe it is, some people close to Kano, including Kano, they helped the emperor to sign what's called the Imperial Rescript on Education. It is going to define who is the imperial subject. How are they going to act? And they're going to act like warriors. And then one of Kano's contemporaries, his friend at University of Tokyo, writes about Bushido. So you can't have Budo without Bushido. And their definition of Bushido is very complex because it's a superimposition of a goal over a very dispersed body of literature.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we look at Jewish literature, Christian literature, there's a religion. There's a religion that exists, and then people are writing to describe their experience with this religion, what they think about it. Some people write things that are discarded. There are books of the old Bible that have been discarded by modern Christians. These things, and it's hundreds of years. But imagine that in Bushido shows up in Japan, and the word doesn't exist until around 1900.
So you're saying it's the opposite. There are lots of different traditions, and they're trying to create one unified thinking under the word Bushido?
Yes. Okay. And this literally Ministry of Education bureaucrats and people associated with martial arts, not even called Budo at the time, it still predates Budo, but they're saying, how do we instill the proper spirit into Japanese children? What spirit will that be? Now remember that samurai are no more than 16% of the population. In most Han, they're even less. And they're the ones getting the martial arts education, but they're not getting instillation. They're not being instilled with Bushido. They're being instilled with a Han history, how you act, Shido. So here's these gentlemen in late 1890s. There's a magazine that only about 5 or 6 volumes were printed called Bushido. And it's all these ideas of how they're going to instill a new culture into the new Japan, the children of the new Japan. Nitobe writes Bushido in America for Americans. He writes it in English, beautiful English, but it's unconnected to anything going on in Japan. He thinks he invented the term. He's surprised he comes to Japan and they're already talking about Bushido. He's surprised because he thought he invented the term, he said. Kano writes in that magazine in the late 1890s. And then Bushido. What is Bushido? So one of Kano's other colleagues is a philosopher. He's the head of the philosophy department in the University of Tokyo. His name is Inoue Tetsujiro. He's a doctor. He's studying in Germany when Kano studies in Europe. And he becomes the official chronicler of Bushido. This is the short version, Bushido Sousho. The Library of Bushido. It's 1,200 pages. It's 3 volumes in one. It's from 1909. The unabridged version is 12 volumes. Okay? The word Bushido does not appear in the text. It appears in the foreword. Why? They come up with a philosophy that's going to teach how to be a warrior to every Japanese child, how to be a striving, not a fighter, but a warrior. How to be a warrior, and they're going to base it on Japanese traditional thought. So it's like the Christian Bible where Jesus doesn't appear, if you can imagine. Bushido doesn't appear in these 1,200 pages except for the foreword. So they group it all together and sell that to the Ministry of Education. So you can't separate Budo from Bushido from martial arts in the pre-war period. So you cut all of, and guess what? It's all in the service of the emperor. It all stems from the emperor. So post-war, you cut the emperor out. You cut out the notion that martial arts instructors are teaching children ethics, morals, anything else. You cut out Tanren. What's left? You have a sport. And they're very careful not to mention these things. Why? Because they want to make a living. And the only way they're going to be allowed to make that living, and of course there's a reaction of the population too. They blame these people for having ruined the country, having killed all their children. So it's a very conscious effort. And I've been looking at these pages for years trying to find the word Bushido. It doesn't exist. It only shows up in the Japanese dictionary in 1900.
That's very interesting. That reminds me of a parallel I often do between Budo, Bushido and Shinto. Like Shinto is just a collection of various legends that they put everything in one book and they say that's the Japanese religion. But even at the time, the first books, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki were put together. It was like people from the south had no idea what people from the north were doing. They had absolutely, and vice versa, they had no ideas. But that, at the time, formed one book. And you don't see the word Shinto that much. I mean, Shinto is easy, it's the way of the gods. So, but as a word that name the Japanese religion, no, it's just called the way of the god. It's not even the name of a religion.
Right.
I mean, you're not Christian, you're Shinto. Yeah, well, Shinto, it's the way of the gods. It's not a name. I mean, the Christian, you have the Christ at least. Right. You have something, and they put everything together. It doesn't really become a religion before centuries after that, and it's in the service of the emperor.
It's in the service of the emperor, so you can.
It's to justify the role of the emperor, and a few, not even 100 years later, you have Buddhism coming. I think Buddhism is sport. It's coming into Shinto, and it becomes one, and it feels the same for me for Bushido and sport. It's like there was the Bushido that was created with the collection of various ideas that were sometimes completely exclusive. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you read Yagyu and Musashi, you can find things that are forgot the name, the Hagakure and the Heihoka Densho and the Gorin no Sho, and you don't have much more. There is the Koyogungan that Alex Bennett used for his research, but I would love to have a modern version of that book because it's very hard to read. And there are mutually exclusive stuff in this. But it became one Bushido. It's really crazy to see people. I mean, we engrave a lot of weapons, stuff like that here, and people, they're asking for the virtues of Bushido on their weapons. So like,
which one?
You're asking for the Christian virtues of Nitobe, maybe, but not really virtues of Bushido.
There's, I have come across in my research to understand that there's a huge misconception regarding Bushido. But for Shinto, you can trace it back to a historic event, 1870. It's the Shinbun Bunrei, the law that separates Shinto from Buddhism. And then there was another effort where they actually separated shrine Shinto from state Shinto. And state Shinto becomes the underpinnings of the emperor worship system.
And to try to remove all the Buddhist icons from the temple at the time. It was just a crazy period.
And they did. It was by law. They had to decide. They didn't evacuate every small Shinto shrine from every Buddhist temple, but
all national shrines had to be purified from Buddhism.
The state shrines were different. They were run by the Shinto Kyoku. Okay, and a similar organization exists today. It's private. It's at Meiji Shrine. But the original organization still exists. It's over in Nishiazabu. The descendant, it's very interesting. It was established, and they tried to proselytize all of Japan to get everybody to become Shinto, the new Shinto. And it failed miserably. So they stopped after a year or two. They just quit. But it existed, and then it was brought together by people like Inoue, Tetsujiro. And they instilled it into the schools. And the question was, what sort of people are the Japanese going to become? Because if you think about Japanese culture in the Edo period, the samurai and the court, the kazoku, the court nobles, were only a small percentage of the country. The real Japanese culture was earthy, slapstick comedy, physical humor, you know, people in the cities or peasants. I mean, these are earthy, solid, simple people, but rich culture of a different sort of comedy, different sort of thing. And there were people that literally decided, we don't want the new Japan to be like that. We want to mimic Western chivalry. So you can see books where they're comparing Western chivalry to Bushido. And how are they going to do the same thing? So many of these ideas that later become the downfall of Japan came from countries like France, countries like Germany, total mobilization, teaching military, the American
education from England, Spencer. And
Spencer plays a very important role in the early days of Budo that I explore in my website and my book, The Kano Chronicles. It's called Spencer. Herbert Spencer is very well thought of in Japan at the right time when the country is being established. So you're on the right track. So 2 or 3 people have written books on Bushido. Dr. Oleg Benish's invention of the samurai, and
the body politics, the Meiji Restoration too.
That's the paper.
Yeah.
And that's his thesis, and it becomes another.
Yes, exactly.
Inventing Bushido, I think.
Yeah.
His is a seminal academic work, and I know of one other that's being done now, and I think the guy is on the right track. I think that he's a college professor that I know a bit. I think he's on the right track, but I think he's missed the key. And I found, in connection with Kano, I found the key to Bushido. It's like the Rosetta Stone of Bushido. And without this, nothing makes a lot of sense. As you say, these people aren't connected. I think that people that try to impose some philosophy on some of these martial arts, it's overcooked, it's overdone. There is no philosophy. You have the philosophy of one person who did the martial art. Is it integral to the martial art? Often it's not. It's a personal belief, spiritual belief. Musashi, is this great philosopher. It's about fighting. It's one-on-one fighting, which is often the case in the ancient Chinese strategy texts. They're actually about fighting one-on-one, and people extrapolate from that to life and dealing with the world and everything. But in working with Kano, he had some takes on Bushido that led me to find what I think is the Rosetta Stone to understand all of Bushido. And it's one of 100 things he was involved in that no one knows today. So it's going to be a surprise, and I'll have to show you some other time.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, to me, it's the very last thing I really have an interest in regarding Budo and Japanese history. I mean, it's nice to read a book or two times to times, but I've did Japanese studies and read a lot of books. I broadly know Japanese history. I know the period that I like the most because I read the most about them. Mm-hmm. And I probably read more or less everything that has been written about Budo. I mean, Oleg Benesh, Alexander Bennett, and even things that are not books that Peter Scoresbury, the former International Aikido Federation chairman, wrote lots of articles online in Aikido Journal, yes. Other forums.
Brilliant research, brilliant writing. Yes.
Yeah, I love his writing. It's really it's complex, but not too much, and a lot of sources. Really nice. But I think once you've read, and there are not that many books, maybe it's about Budo or Bushido, good books, maybe 20 books at most. And about Japanese history, the overall story of Japan, if you have 20 books, you're set. And from there, the only thing, because of my personal life, but I think it's the same thing for you, we pursue the same goal, is where does that idea of Bushido come from, and why is it so misunderstood everywhere? I mean, Alex Bennett wrote this book, Bushido, forgot the title, The Japanese version was the Nihonjin no Shiranai Bushido, the Bushido the Japanese don't know about.
Right.
And the Japanese book is a little shorter, but the idea is the same. And well, it's not complex ideas. You read the books, oh, yes, it's obvious. There is no controversy in that. You just read history and you understand that Bushido is just an invention. There is no hard concept behind Bushido. And why is it so hard to make people understand that very simple fact? I really don't get it. That's probably my last big interrogation about Budo. I'd love people in the West to have a little more liberty in their thinking of what Budo or Bushido is. Maybe Budoka would be better people and better Budoka if they were not that much focused on something that is actually pretty much a huge bank of smoke. But
okay,
you
and that's why I think when I found this one very short document that explains what Bushido really is, and it's right at the door of World War II, where Bushido is being used to train young soldiers going off to war. It's being used as an excuse by people who do some horrible things. And then the question post-war, I think, is that people really don't understand it. They've not read it. They've heard something from their sensei, and it has a great deal of appeal to follow the path of the warrior, to conduct yourself as a warrior, not as someone who goes to war. I was a warrior. The last thing a real warrior wants to do is to go to war. It's a great idea that other people have, but the warriors who go, they really don't want to go to war. There are exceptions. You try to stay away from them in peacetime, and you try to be close to them in wartime, but they're not good people to be around. But the average soldier is a warrior in many ways, but you can be a warrior. And one marvelous reference I have is a U.S. educator who goes to a technical school in the backside of Japan in Toyama or someplace. And he's going around the country, and he goes to this technical school for agricultural training. And he goes into the dojo, and there are judo gis and kendo gear hanging in the dojo. He's very surprised. He said, "Why are you having these implements of war? Why are you training these young men to be warriors?" And the principal of the school says, "Japan needs strong farmers too. We need strong men. We need strong farmers. Not everyone has a chance to be a warrior for the emperor, a soldier for the emperor. Everyone can be a warrior." And it takes the Christian aback because he associates it with aggressive, dangerous activities, with an attitude that is harmful to other people. Whereas the Japanese sees it as making a fully rounded man. Bunbu, Ryodo.
Yeah, but that's what I was saying before.
Yes.
You have to combine both. If you only have the Bu, there's so much missing.
So I think that post-war this has been greatly misunderstood in many ways because the underpinnings of it were the emperor system. You're becoming, and this is what led me on this path of research, where I would find judo books completely different from what Kano said. Kano was saying judo is this, and judo books saying judo makes you a better warrior to serve the emperor better, to become useful for the emperor however he wants you to be. And that is the way, that is Budo, that is Bushido, so it's completely opposite of what Kano says. But post-war, all of this is cut out. The key documents have never been translated. So the ancient documents, the Edo and before documents, have almost no bearing on it. It's all the superstructure of modern Bushido that's put in place. So there's no way to explain it post-war. It's like Aikido was all about the emperor. Aiki Bujutsu was, doing great things for the emperor. Post-war, it seems to me that Ueshiba Morihei substitutes universal love for the emperor and just leaves it alone.
Yeah, but I think it's because the emperor wasn't the figure of a man. It was the figure of symbolic authority. And when this symbol disappeared, then he had to put something to replace it.
Right.
And love in the universe is a good replacement for the symbolic emperor.
This is part of the conscious policy of GHQ, which was informed by reading the documents of one of Kano's associates. MacArthur's psychological operations people used the documents produced by one of Kano's close associates to build the psychological operations to understand Japanese culture and how to attack it and how to control it and to channel it into more peaceful routes. So one of the things they did was remove all emperor worship. So you couldn't have Aikido that said, this is part of emperor worship. So they had to do something. So they just replaced it with universal love. Judo became a sport. They didn't need any of that. Kendo becomes pliant staff play. Shinai Kyogi, competition with completely different uniforms. So Judo was allowed to start again by 1948-49. They had all Japan Judo competition. Judo was being taught openly. Everybody was happy. Kendo was never allowed to start again during the occupation. It was allowed to be practiced privately, but no national level tournaments or anything else. It was only after the occupation ends that Kendo is allowed to once again have more public demonstrations in this. Why? Because Kendo was very much integrally involved in this whole notion. And I think that's what the Kendo Renmei would like to forget. And some people don't want to explore that aspect of
Some
Kendo.
people have tried to research the connections between war criminals during the war and Kendo, and it's clearly not welcome.
No, it's not welcome, but it also, I'm not sure it's realistic, because there's no one in charge, unless it's General Araki Sadao, who is one of my characters, a fascinating guy, who, if there's anybody who's the counterpart of Kano for Kendo, it's General Araki Sadao. But bear in mind that almost all senior Japanese army officers in particular understood Kendo, and many, many of them practiced Kendo, at least as young men, if not continuing on. And Araki Sadao takes a very active role in the guidance of Kendo. And once again, the teachers in the schools, and you'll see some of my materials coming out maybe next year, a big video production. The teachers of Kendos in the schools were 60 to 80% former military men who were either injured in combat, who had served their time, gotten out, and they became physical education instructors. So the impact of the Army on this whole process is very, very big. And that's the part that people want to forget.
Just to clarify the concept of warrior that you used before, because I think it's a key concept in the discussion. For you, a warrior is not only someone who can fight in war, but someone who actually can fight outside of a military. How do I put that? Let me rephrase that. Warriors being able to fight in general for life, for work, for people, and not only against things or people, while a fighter is someone who fights in war. That's what I understand from your concept. I just want to be sure that.
Yes, you can have a fighter who fights on the street, someone who fights in a war, but the Japanese were very fascinated by chivalry. the knighthood, the self-sacrificing, the noble knight who sacrifices his time and effort to perform a important deed or to work in service of his lord. In American Indians, there were warrior societies. In most primitive tribes, there are warrior societies. Some are secret men's societies where they take themselves apart and they do certain things that initiate them into this secret society of warriors. So it's a source of pride. It's a source of motivation. It is a reminder that you have disciplines where you need to contribute to someone other than yourself. You have to be prepared for sacrifice. These are very attractive notions to most men of any culture or age. It's not every man, but many men. Many women are attracted to this notion that I serve the world at large, my family, my community, my country, the world, by being a better person, by being ready to not fight, but to struggle, to work hard, to produce, to be the right person.
There was this idea, I think, in the 70s that a Japanese businessmen, salarymen, were the modern samurais.
Right.
That was the saying.
And
they were not fighting, obviously.
But they are sacrificing. They are working hard to prepare. They're not frivolous. They're
trying to save their country from poverty and make Japan part of the greatest nations, and sacrificing their wives, kids, time, everything, working on this idea.
There have always been people trying to understand Japanese culture. And the earliest reference I can find to Japan as being the country that uses jujutsu is like 1891, through the mid 1890, 95, where Japan as a nation uses jujutsu as a warrior nation to defeat China and to get its businesses, get its factories up and moving. You know, they had one of the earliest railroad systems in Asia, one of the best in the world at a very early time. They had telegram systems all over the country. These things happened with such rapidity, and people trying to understand, how does little poor Japan, do all these things? And one of the explanations was jujutsu. They've learned how to work, even though they're being oppressed by these giant foreign powers, they're using them to get technology, to get money into Japan, to use them to the best effect. So this notion spreads throughout. So I think that post-war, it's just very difficult for people to understand that this was imposed on the martial arts, that Budo, this notion of Budo, notion of Bushido, were not common to instructors of martial arts in the Edo period, that it became something as part of what is called invented culture, when some sociologists talk about this.
I see. But that's not a ridiculous idea, actually. It's a pretty interesting idea. Japan using foreign oppression to acquire technology, and this is a form of non-resistance, a form of jujutsu. It is pretty accurate if you can actually go back in time, and Japan is very rarely fighting. I mean, before Meiji, there was no Japan. There was a more or less unified Edo, but with still very huge differences between regions. And before Edo, it was civil war all the time. So, but yes, if you look into details of Japanese history, you see that you don't have this logic that we had in Europe mainly of all-in wars. You know? And maybe there is something in that infused that is still in modern Budo.
the Japanese were collecting as much information as they could about the outside world. One of the first total wars was considered the War of the Triple Alliance in 1870 in South America, Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, in a war that essentially wiped out the losing side. Then the wars into Europe and this notion of total war. So World War I was a total shock to the Japanese. And Kano Sensei writes about the necessity of having strong, virile, warrior children getting ready to help defend the nation in the event they had to. It wasn't planning on total war. He was saying that that's the way the world is going. So this is a very current topic during World War I and afterwards with the Japanese. How does little Japan defend itself in this age of total mobilization, total war? And they learned it from the Prussians, and they learned it from the French, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, right? Franco-Prussian War leading up, and all of these struggles, it got worse and worse, and there's more people involved, and there's more industry required to get it. And the Japanese people like Kano, who are strategic thinkers, involved in the development of the country, said we have to have an answer for this. And part of the answer was having military training, martial arts training for the children.
Well, ironically, the first thing they did when they went at war against the US, it's, I'm going to punch you in the face. That was a very frontal attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was probably the dumbest thing they ever did, because they lost the war because of it. If they continued on this very sneaky way of doing things, they could have got much more from World War II.
Well, would make an interesting alternative history, I think, an alternate history, I believe you call it. What would have happened if the Japanese had just stopped at Manchuria? And the sanctions, the economic sanctions, were really hurting them very badly. And Kano was very aware of this. He writes on it. He writes on it privately. He talks about it. At the time, he was very well connected at the top of the Japanese government. I won't go into the details, but he knew the prime minister, he knew the foreign minister, he knew what was going on in China, he knew what was going on in the United Nations, or the League of Nations, rather, and was very, very concerned about it because he thought it would lead to war.
There was an interesting use of this jujutsu in the post-war situation when Japan somewhat negotiated with the US for economic support, let's say,
yes,
and especially the fixed exchange rate between yen and US dollar, which basically made Japan rich. This again used their very smart jujutsu way of not fighting with people, but using the situation to make the best of it. And I often say that the Japanese economic miracle of the 70s, it's not a miracle. It's very smart politicians who actually knew how to con the rest of the world. They sold their stuff to the world for half the price for decades, and that made them rich. And they could do that because they used the fact, well, I'm probably pushing a little too much, but I think some Japanese thought that the US felt a little bad, and probably the whole Western world felt a little bad about the atomic bombing, and that they could push a little their luck.
Well, they also, clearly, the United States and its allies wanted a bulwark against communist expansion off the mainland. You look at what China has done with the same opportunities, and it's only recently where they cut essentially a tacit deal with the United States to have sort of the same thing. You can sell your goods to us, we'll buy them, but you're going to develop and become a normal nation. That was the hope with Japan, but I think it's also an admiration for the Japanese people, their abilities. And as you say, they were very bright about it. They cut a great deal, but they took advantage of it. Not only did they cut the right deal,
Took huge advantage.
they took huge advantage of it and continue to do it. And I came here, to live right after the yen had gone from 360, went to 320, 280, 240. And I remember I was a young captain at the time. I didn't have a lot of money. There was a Yamaha motorcycle that I really wanted to buy. It was in the PX. And I walked in one day, it was $1,200, and the same thing was whatever. It was $3,000 or more in the United States. And I was, I'm going to come back and buy it tomorrow. I went back the next day, it was $1,800. And I said, well, I don't know, I need to ask my wife. I went back the next day, it was $2,800 because the yen had been disconnected. And of course, that was a huge shock. But there are some interesting ways of looking at this. I'll send you a book that I think is one of the best introductions to Japan that most people have never heard of, but I'll send you a copy of the PDF if you're interested in economic history. This is a really good one, which has a great cultural history. And to me, I wish I'd seen it before I came, and misunderstood just how Confucian this society is. And this helped me understand that it is much more Confucian than we realize, and what that means, and also what it means to an American who does or does not understand Confucianism. And in the martial arts, you see certain Confucian aspects. It's also reflected in traditional Shinto, in Buddhism, and there are all these influences back and forth. So Japan has been shaped by a lot of external forces. And it's come into something where foreigners like us have an affiliation, an affinity, and an attraction to aspects of that culture. But if you peel it back too far, you realize that there's a lot of misunderstanding beneath it. So how do you support that without succumbing to the notion that it's something that it's not? And I hope to help something like this. And my work at the Kano Chronicles will actually help put this into context so people have a greater appreciation for it, but a realistic appreciation.
Yeah, I agree. Japan is, even when you start to really, you dig deeper and deeper, and you start to realize that, well, some of the things you thought were good about Japan are not that good. But that's just one step, say, well, I'm judging by my modern Western moral. If I put things in context, well, it's not as good as I thought, but it doesn't mean that it's bad in itself. So you can keep digging, and probably you'll never reach the bottom. There will be always something to learn, to study, to work on. But at least if we can help people to have some basic understanding of the fact that what they know is actually full of misconceptions. And as you said, in Budo, I think the best example is the whole Bushido, Nitobe, and Chivalry story. I mean, modern Westerners nowadays are really fascinated by the samurai culture that Japan is selling us now, and that was built on ideas brought from the West and chivalry. So basically, people who actually are fascinated by samurai today, they're fascinated by chivalry.
Yes.
And they probably are fascinated by the way the Japanese wrote the story, because they're very good writers in that sense. I mean, I'm pushing the reasoning too far. Of course, it's not exactly what it is, but
I think it's close.
It's a way of putting it, and
it is striking to me, and I was well prepared because of my education in Japanese, formal education in speaking, reading Japanese, learning how to read pre-war Japanese, historical education as a soldier, education in mobilization, education in war plans, education in physical training for young men, because I did that in the military, and realizing, as you say, many of these elements that that made Japan, pre-war Japan, what it was, actually came from the West. The brutal discipline in the Imperial Japanese Army came from the Prussian Army. The total mobilization plans came from studies of the French and the German systems and the Russians, comparing them back and forth. The notion of Bushido coming from chivalry. The very notion of a Budo, this way that becomes an encompassing path in which a man comes to develop. Those terms were not really thought of in Edo, Japan. They come up in the early Meiji era where they're struggling to figure out how they're going to educate their population. What culture will we teach our people? What works best for us given our situation? And as you say, it didn't develop naturally. It was consciously done and introduced by people. And one of those key people was Kano Jigoro in his role as a very senior Ministry of Education bureaucrat.
I think we could work, we could study or start a study to see what would be the connection between Christianism and the thinking of the Christianism, the philosophy behind it, in the deification of the Japanese emperor, because for almost a millennia they had shoguns, emperors working together in a not unified country, and the beginning of the Meiji era was pretty much okay, but from some point it started to escalate very quickly. I mean, the emperor became a god in 50 years. And it's interesting to see that it's not in the original Japanese framework, actually, historically speaking. So where does that come from? I mean, that's also interesting.
It originally came from a small group of men, a committee of men working with the Ministry of Education. And one's a foreigner. Three Japanese, Kano's one of the Japanese, and they set up the first ethics training program in Japan. And it's based on Herbert Spencer's thoughts. And it becomes the official ethics training program for Japan. The minister is assassinated by one of Kano's students.
Who was the minister?
Moriarty Nori.
Yeah.
Moriarty Nori is killed by one of Kano's Jujutsu students. And there's this whole story about how that evolves. But utilitarianism becomes the key to Japanese original. And then as a counter to that, as a backlash to that, the emperor system is installed, because the traditionalists think that utilitarianism is simply not acceptable in Japan. And that's where it starts in the Imperial Rescript on Education, which places the emperor into a position. But it's not mandatory at the beginning. It sits there like a time bomb, and it only shows up, it only starts to swell up and take over the country after some incidents in the Taisho era, Taisho and early Showa era. But the roots lie in early Meiji era. And once again, Kano is a member of the committee that formulates this.
So it's been quite a while, 2 hours and 43 minutes of recording, plus the discussion we had before recording. It's been quite a while, quite a long interview. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting time. I'm very much looking forward to our next discussions, be it in front or not in front of the camera. Probably not, sorry, but we cannot record everything. We'll put the link to your blog in the description
of
the video. And maybe a note at the beginning of the video so people check the description, and on Facebook and everything, of course. When you're publishing a book, right?
Yes.
Okay, so when your book comes out, make sure to tell us or directly drop a comment below the video, and I'll pin the comment so it comes at the top.
Oh, okay, thank you. That's very kind.
We'll share. I'll read it first, and if I like it, which I don't really doubt, but if I like it, I'll share it everywhere I can. Yes, very much looking forward for what can happen next, discussions, whatever. We have been not in lockdown in Japan because of the COVID, but in a situation in which all events have been cancelled since almost a year.
Yeah.
So no occasion to meet people on Budo events. And it's probably going to be the case until at least next April, I think. I don't know what you think, but it's probably April.
Well, Judo is the worst, so...
Judo was the worst.
We are concerned.
Yeah, but I hope that once all this is over, we'll have the opportunity to meet on various events and make collaborations if we can, whatever. Anyway, thank you very much. If you have a last word for the people watching...
No, I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. We rambled a bit, but there's a tremendous amount of ground to cover, and it's always good to be able to talk to someone who has your background and interest and can spur on the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, and see you for the next interview, in a few weeks, I guess. Bye.
Good night.